All right, so in this example, I'm going to just do one refactoring on our non-scaffolded blog. I'm going to take it from the point for sort of removing some repetition from my views. So if you remember how the blog was working, we had a index to our post controller that showed all of the blog posts, and for any blog post that existed in the system, I could go and edit that blog post by way of a form. And if I wanted to create a new blog post, there was also a link at the bottom that allowed me to do so. And at the time, I talked about my views not being dry and that I was repeating myself. So my new and my edit look almost identical. If I go back and forth between the two, what's the difference between these two? Just the little submit button, right? That's it. We've actually seen that the submit button itself has sort of good default text. So I can do this and save it, and I can do this and save it. Now the two views are identical. And if I go to my application as it's running, on the new view, the default text for my blog post is create post. That seems decent. If I go and edit something, the default text is update. The form is aware of what it's doing because we built it for something, right? It's form for post. So it knows if it's either a new empty post or if it's one that's being edited. So it can, based on that knowledge, create a nice default for our button. So now we have two views that are absolutely identical. The only difference is what's at the very top is this H2, one saying create a new blog post and the other saying edit. What I'd like to be able to do is I'd like to be able to take out all of this code here and be able to do something along the lines of this. Render the form. I'd like to be able to do that, and you should think of this render call as almost like a method for HTML, giving us the ability to render out a template that can be reused throughout our code. And so the name of the template is form. I could call it anything. So this is a sort of a programmer specified name here. And I would have this same render message in both. So this is my edit, but also inside of the new, I could have the same render message, render form. That certainly dried up my views, but where do I put my form now? Where do I actually put it so that this render command can have access to it? And so that I go to my view folder. This is the folder where both the new and the edit exist, and I'm going to create a new file here. And the file I'm going to create is going to be called _form.html.erb. So the fact that it's called form is because of the fact that that's what I used as my argument to render. Again, I've just picked that name to describe what it is. And the fact that it starts with an underscore is an indication to Rails that it's one of these special templates, and Rails calls them partials. And so when you run this render command, or when you say render form, Rails is going to look in the folder that you're in for a _form.html.erb. That's just a convention. So whatever you call it here, underscore that thing.html.erb will be loaded. And so now I can paste in what I cut out of the others, and I've removed that repetition from my code. I have the form in one location, and I'm rendering it from two locations. So anytime I change this form, I now only need to change it in one place. So if blog posts suddenly became more complicated and there was more fields that I needed to include in my form, well, I would add them in the form partial, and those fields would then be replicated in both the new and the edit views. And so just saving me the hassle of constantly having to edit the form in two places. So we can go and quickly take a look at to see if this is going to work. Go back to my blog. If I create a new post, I get this form which says create post at the bottom of it. So new post from partial. This is the content of this new partial post. That seems to work. And if I was to edit that post, I also get a nice form. I can say edited right there. And I can also add the fact that it was edited here. This was edited. And I can update. And you can see that the edits have actually gone through, all thanks to my form partial. So you can do much more complex things with partials. You can have variables that you can pass into them, just like you would pass in arguments into a method. As you can see here, they also end up sharing the instance variables of the views that call them. So inside of form.html.erb, I'm making use of this @post variable, and I can make use of it because both the new and the edit view had access to an @post variable. If we looked at the controllers, the edit and the new both made available an @post variable. So the views have access to the instance variables created by the controller actions, and partials have access to the instance variables that are available in the scope of the view that calls them. So when we're rendering out the form in both of these cases, the form has access to that same @post variable that was initially available to these two views separately. And you can do much more complicated things with render. If you go and look at the layout guide in the Rails guides, there's a whole section on using partials. I also have a section in my Rails notes that goes over some of the different ways to use partials. And so they show you here, the plain old rendering of a partial. So this would just look for an underscore menu, because they've said render menu. So it would say look for an underscore menu.html.erb. You might have partials that you want to share amongst your entire application. So you could make, for example, a shared folder inside of your views folder and put a partial in there and call it by specifying sort of a path. So shared/menu will look in the app view shared folder for an underscore menu.html.erb. And partials get progressively more complicated from that point on. And so you can pass in variables. Here's a partial by the name of form, just like we've created, but I'm passing in locals, and I'm saying you should have access to a variable called zone. And what happens here is this local hash, any of the keys that you make available inside of the locals hash turn into a variable inside of the partial. So there will be a zone variable, not an @zone, but a zone variable accessible within the partial. Now you might say, well, what's the point of that? I thought the instance variables got inherited. The point is that to have the instance variables inherited is a little bit like breaking encapsulation. And so you maybe want to have your form be a little bit more encapsulated. So here we're making use of an @post variable, but I could sort of fix this up to just use a post variable. And then when I render my form, I could say that it has some locals, and one of those locals is called post, and that's my @post variable. And that way I'm sort of explicitly specifying what I'm passing into this particular partial. And so by saying that we have locals with a key of post here, this object will now be accessible by way of a post variable, not an @post variable. And so I should be able to go back to my code now, and it should still work. So let's quickly test that out. If I edit this form, undefined local variable post. And what has Kyle done wrong today? Locals. Form for zone made available by local zone. Oh, I might have to do. There's different ways of calling a partial, and in this case, I guess when I'm adding things like locals, I can't use just the short form of render form. I have to explicitly say render the partial that goes by the name of form, passing it the locals local hash. And now it works. So again, that's just another example of Rails conventions. When you have sort of nothing to pass to a partial, you can get away with using this really short form version of calling a partial, just saying render form. If you want to get more complicated with it, you do the long form, saying render the partial called form, giving it the locals, and then specifying the locals that are to be sort of made for that particular partial. If I look further into the guide, you can have partials that are built or based off of objects, and they end up, it's sort of like creating new variables by way of the locals, but they end up existing within the partial, I think based on the name of the partial itself. You can also end up doing fancy things like saying render, and then you can specify a instance variable that is either a active record object or an active record collection, and then it will automatically look in this case for a underscore customer.html.erb and make a customer variable accessible. And if I had, for example, and this is a really cool part of partials, if I had a collection, so let's say eventually you're going to be creating an e-commerce store where you have a bunch of products. Here I'm saying render the partial called products for the collection products. It actually automatically loops through all of the products in that collection, rendering the partial once for each product. And so it's a way of sort of really having a consistent and sort of short way of displaying a template or a partial over and over and over for a collection of objects. So partials end up being really, really powerful things to use in your code. They reduce the size of the code and they remove repetition from your code. And so we'll be using them throughout the course from now on.